here we go. So hi, Austin Harney from you're here in the UK. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Austin Harney. Well, I'm autistic as well, so I'm also I'm on the National Executive Committee of my own trade union, PCS, which is the trade union for the civil service. I'm also on the TUC Disabled Workers Committee, that's the trade union congress. But I do spend a lot of my time on top of my day job. I do a lot of personal cases. I represent members up to employment tribunals, including those who are disabled. I also fight for disabled workers' rights, particularly here in Britain and Northern Ireland. And also I represent all the members in my own trade union as well. Yeah, this is what I actually do, is also fight for autistic rights as well as other disabled people's rights. And there's many other campaigns that I'm involved in, as you probably follow me on Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're an incredible activist, firstly, and I see how hard you work, and your written work is very, very good as well, Austin. You do a lot of campaign work against fascism and racism as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, fighting the far right, I suppose, in England and beyond?
Yeah, we have a very strong group in Britain, a strong campaigning group, quite a few. There's Hope Not Hate. There's now what used to be Unite Against Fascism, but we also call it Stand Up to Racism. So we're involved with many MPs. We have meetings in Parliament. We have conferences every year. We also have a lot of big, strong rallies throughout Britain, throughout London, and all the other regional towns, particularly in England, Wales, and Scotland. And no doubt there are the protest marches that we have in Northern Ireland too. But I think it's very important that we continue to fight against racism, fascism, and that includes all sorts of other hate crime, which includes ableism. That is very strong. We need to incorporate that. But also the fact is, Fiona, I'll just try and emphasise, it was reported by John McDonnell, the MP, who was Shadow Chancellor at the time when he made the speech. He said there is a far-right Facebook page, and so far it's got 10 million followers in Britain, and that's quite frightening. And now, when I'm hearing the stories in Ireland as well, the far-right emerging there, that's something we need to really build and give support. I'm second-generation Irish. We suffered a lot of racism, Irish immigrants in Britain, and so we need to give as much support and helping hand to the anti-fascist groups in Ireland too. So.
And there's a crossover as well between the advocacy work that we're doing, which is, as you said, regarding helping the autistic community, autistic rights, disabled people, fighting the quack treatments that are given to autistic people. We see the far right involved in that quackery as well. So that's how I kind of ended up falling into this campaigning against the far right through my campaign work, protecting autistic people from pseudoscience and dangerous, unproven treatments, etc. I suppose the next question I'd like to ask you is about, I suppose, your diagnosis. You're an autistic adult like myself, we're both on the spectrum, and how it's been for you growing up in the UK with that diagnosis, supports you've had, and your concerns regarding supports for autistic people now and the future. Austin, it would be great if you could just share a few comments with that. Thank
you. That's a very interesting one. And I was diagnosed at the age of 4. And of course, I'm going to say something controversial, which we'll talk about later in a minute. It's not controversial to me and probably not to you. Some people do, which is ridiculous. But I was born with lack of oxygen in the brain, which damaged the audio cortex of my brain at the time. And then what happened was there were some abnormal signs of development. Well, they call that term abnormal, so please forgive me if I've used that word. That is the wrong word to use. What we would call stimming today, hand flapping, that was discovered at the age of 4. I was doing that. I had a speech problem, so that's why I had a diagnosis. And what happened was, it was the top child psychiatrist in the world. He apparently was director of international mental health through the World Health Organization. His name was Dr. Ken Soddy. He actually diagnosed me as autistic. Now, get a diagnosis in those days, it had to be far more severe. And up until the 70s, autistic children were automatically taken away from their parents and put in care homes for the rest of their lives, never to see the families again. I think they relaxed that in the 70s. But Dr. Ken Soddy recommended to my mother that I would be not fit for mainstream society. That wasn't the term we used in those days, it was normal society. And so we'd be institutionalized, we'd have to be put in a special school, which were absolutely appalling in those days as well. So yeah, it was quite an experience. I mean, a brutal experience. I was actually forced against my will to go to a special school. It was only 4 at the time, but it was absolutely appalling how they were treated in those days as well. Just to give you one brutal example, we were stuck in this autistic compound at the back of the mainstream school. And it was really hot sunny day and there was no air conditioning in those days. We were suffocating for hours. So when my mother came to pick me up, she asked, why are you doing this, to the teaching staff? And they said, because the parents of the normal children are here today. And if they find out about this compound, they will take their children away from the school. It was the Harvest Festival. So that was to give you an idea of how brutal it was. And so I was getting worse. My parents took me away. They battled to get me into other schools. I think I wasn't in the school for about 7 months, at least, at one stage as well. That was between the ages of 4 and 7, I can't remember. But I went finally back to the school I was in, that was taken away from. So through the support from my family, I was sort of like, you know, given as much support as possible to grow up in mainstream education. Of course, I've just mentioned stimming because I'm confessing now for the first time ever. I've never said that before. I've only come out in the open about my autism in 2013. I had to keep that a secret because I couldn't trust the British society I lived in at the time. But stimming was seen as absolutely abnormal, and I would end up, and to use the term, the funny farm as well. So that's how dreadful. So everything had to be suppressed. And of course, suppressing that type of stimming doesn't do the child any good, it makes it worse. And so what happens is one can end up disappearing in one's room for hours, and that's combined with mental depression as well, which can be a disaster. And I had a hell of that, had quite a problem with that in my teens when I was at a boarding school. I also had a problem with social skills as well. But thanks to my sister, when I left that boarding school and she was helping me out with socializing, that really transformed me quite a bit in learning how to get on with people. That was from the ages of 18 or 19. So that's to give you an idea what it was like growing up as an autistic person. And then employment was another story because they had no reasonable adjustments before the Disabilities Discrimination Act became law in 1995. It was in 1991, 92 that I was dismissed from civil service. I was getting no support help from anybody. Management was saying they were trying to help me, but couldn't do anything. No support from welfare, but the only people who stuck their necks out were the militant trade union representatives in the workplace. Despised by management, they decided to stick my head there, decided to represent me, and they reinstated me back into the civil service. And of course, that's how I became very active in the trade union as well. So that's to give you a brief general synopsis or a general background of what it was like growing up as an autistic person. It was very painful at the time because people didn't even know what autism was at the time. People just thought I was brain damaged, that was it. And there were people with the most outrageous ableist views as well, to people of my condition. So
the language then was really horrible. And like I grew up in London myself, so I was born in London in 71. And I actually was friends with an autistic boy, can you believe it, at the time, whom I really got on well with because I was on the spectrum, not diagnosed until adulthood. But we used to go to the movies together. And he was in a wheelchair, and I was wondering, had he some other condition? And they put him in a wheelchair because he was autistic. There was nothing wrong with him, you know, physically, that he could walk. And I was annoyed, even at that early age, as to why that little boy was put in a wheelchair. But there was a huge stigma, I suppose, regarding the term. And like you said, I think there was like an embarrassment amongst families and the public. And a lot of these children were seen as, I don't know, otherworldly, you know, some kind of mystery, I suppose is the word. And I found it even at that, I suppose I was 7, maybe that's how old I was. And I was annoyed. I could sense that there was something wrong because he wasn't, you know, physically disabled. He could walk, but they had him literally just put into that position just so that he couldn't express himself or be who he was, you know, which was just being autistic. Like, just for the people watching, I was diagnosed at 42, so a lot later than Austin. But what was really hard for me, I suppose, growing up, I have 5 children, 3 of them are autistic, was trying to get a diagnosis as a woman. So I suppose that's what I want to kind of touch on, that if you're a female, it's very much a male condition. And if you go to your doctor and try to seek supports, you're met with that response. Autism is a male condition. You've got anxiety. So a lot of women, girls get misdiagnosed or ignored. And that leads to, like you said, further distress, anxiety, and suppression, which is a word that I think is really important with how we are seen in the community, that we maybe suppress a lot of our natural coping mechanisms, like stimming. Like my son would rock a lot. He would, you know, kind of, he's always moving. So that's kind of a natural, you know, regulation process for us. It helps us to cope with the environment around us, because autism is a social communication condition, like you said. We have issues with sensory things, so we can be overstimulated very easily with smells, sounds, all those things. So we're trying to juggle all that. We're pretty cool and filter out all of that. For me, like going to the shops would be a nightmare. You know, I've actually changed my life since my diagnosis to not go to the shop, only when it's quiet, to accommodate myself. And it's made huge, you know, benefits in my life. Anxiety is less. I used to get very ill physically when I was in crowds. You know, I would be affected in that way, then I would faint because I couldn't cope with all the noise and the overstimulation. And yeah, I kept going to my GP and it was like, no, you've just anxiety, you just worry too much. When I got my diagnosis, it was hard, I'll be honest with you, for me to feel like all my life I've been basically ignored by the medical profession. But it did change how I appreciated myself, and that I wasn't always blaming myself. Why can't I just, you know, fit in? Why do I have these difficulties, you know, with my life, socially especially? I'll be honest with you, that is, and it's still hard for me. Even doing this today is kind of difficult. I know you, Austin, for a long time and you're my friend, but, you know, I've never done this before. I've never done an interview or a Zoom like this before. So I still have those challenges in my life. You know, that's the other thing. Just because we can communicate here and we're talking doesn't mean that you and I have difficulties in our life. That's why you get a diagnosis, which is the next thing I want to talk about is, you know, the whole reality of the word disability. Autism, I think you agree, is a disability.
Definitely.
And we can be accepting that word because disability is fine. What is your opinion on autistic advocates today that are trying to remove that word from this whole thing and try to say that autism is not a disability? We spoke about that prior to this interview, that you only get supports if you are disabled. You don't get supports for being different. What is your view on that, Austin?
Well, I find that incredible. I've only just discovered this situation in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some autistic advocate organisations out there who have got some outrageous opinions and views. Autism is a way of life, it's an identity. Well, how I grew up is not the same situation. They're also trying to argue, yes, I do agree that spectrum is, you know, misused and abused by medical specialists, but there are spectrums in autism. There are some far more severe than others. And I was attacked even for using that phrase, which beggars belief, because I'll give you the example of the school I went to. There were autistic children who couldn't even speak, you know, some who had no perception of understanding or sound. There was one who was completely devoid of reality. And the sad thing was that a hose pipe one day was sprayed on this young girl, who was about my age at the time. It was only then when she was smiling for the first time, enough to bring tears to parents' eyes. And I don't know where these children are today. Obviously, if they're grown up and if they're still alive, they could well be being looked after in care homes and not communicating with anybody, which is incredibly sad. So when you've got these autistic advocates saying that autism isn't a disability, it's just a way of life, it's quite staggering. It's beyond comprehension. Not many people know about these autistic advocate organisations. It's only beginning to dawn on people in the British Labour Party, in the trade union movement. People are only just gradually waking up with shock horror at the moment, with their attitudes towards other autistic people and the way they discriminate and bully. So no doubt, I'm sure you're going to say a bit more about this, Fiona.
Well, it is because it's happened to me. It's happened to lots of people. Like, you know, I'm all about autism acceptance, and I'm totally against pseudoscience when it comes to autism, or pseudoscience in general. And, you know, a lot of my advocacy work has been campaigning for autistic rights, for acceptance, but like, I take huge concern with what I'm looking at on social media, especially Facebook, with these groups, Autistic Union, which is a name that I learned of, I suppose, in 2017. So they're basically have this ideology that just is about their rules or following their direction, and nobody else can have an opinion. And I was added to a group in 2018 and told that I had to basically obey their orders. It was very frightening for me at the time. It was something like I'd seen, I suppose, in fascist kind of circles or far-right politics, where there's only one way, you know, there's no other way. And one person actually said to me in this group, this was before I refused to sign, you know, their rules or agree to them, that you have to see it like a religion, Fiona. Now, I am not religious at all, as you know. And that really alarmed me. And what I saw were all the people in the group just following the same mantra. A cult, really, this is the only word. I mean, if you look up the word cult, this movement fully describes the meaning of that word. It's basically where you're not allowed to think for yourself anymore. And you are being controlled by people who have developed this cult. And this cult, and it is a cult, and I will call it a cult because I have seen of late further harm. I'm not naming the people in this group. I'm just going to refer to the Autistic Union because there's many. But what really concerns me is how they are campaigning, meaning they terrorize people, they defame them, they bully them, they harass them, they dox them. And this has happened to me and so many people. Loads of autistic campaigners have closed down their Facebook pages because of harassment from these people. Now, I've spoken out, you have, a few people have, and it gets worse. So when you speak out, you're met with further abuse. So it's just like a cycle of, you know, abuse, continuous abuse. But what is interesting, and even yesterday for me, looking at this group more, I'm seeing more people now speaking out, not just on Facebook, but on other platforms, Instagram, Twitter, people coming to me now, and they're telling me that they are suffering the same kind of harassment. And the thing is, we want the same thing as these people. This is the irony. We all want autistic rights. We all want a better world for autistic people. But what we need to do is work together and not ostracize people or target people that don't agree with you. If you don't agree with me on something, we can talk to each other. We don't attack each other. We don't rip each other to pieces. We don't concoct stories. For example, on Twitter the other night, I had put up, I was talking about you coming on the show actually, or me interviewing you. Right. We have a show now, of course, sorry. And somebody messaged me on Twitter saying that they had received a message from someone called the Autistic Zebra, and that they are going around sending messages to people to warn people to stay away from me. Defaming.
Stay away from.
Yeah. No, I haven't even engaged with this Zebra person. I don't know who they are, but that's how bad it's got, that they are private messaging people now, jeopardizing the good work that I do. And I do good work. I don't get paid for my work. I'm not asking for donations like most of these people. I'm not selling merchandise. I am actually taking time out of my busy life. You know that my son has just been battling cancer, my autistic son.
I'm very sorry.
They targeted him as well. I mean, they made comments about his appearance. I've had the most horrendous things said about my son, even up to a few days ago, by some of these so-called advocates. This is not advocacy. It is, it's not even bullying anymore. It's like a cult. They're grooming autistic people to join their cult. They're offering them a space where they will be safe, which is not the truth. If you disagree with them, they will hunt you down, and they will make your life a living hell. And that is something that I really think we need to address, because it doesn't matter if we agree, Austin, or anyone has a differing view. We need to work together, because the most important thing, like we said, is support to autistic people, for the people that need them the most. And now, if these people keep saying that autism is not a disability, they are jeopardizing the support to autistic people, and we will see autistic people institutionalized like we did in the 70s, and even up until the 90s, before my son was born. They were doing that in Ireland. And so the supports that we give to autistic people, be it speech and language therapy, OT, stuff to help them learn skills or tools to be able to go out and be independent. If we don't have them outside of those settings, that we will have our loved ones going back into those places, which are horrible, which take away all their freedoms to be who they want to be. So supports for autistic people is a good thing. But the majority of these people that we're talking about are against supports. They're against interventions of any kind, and saying that autistic people don't need them. But they only see themselves. They don't see anyone but themselves. And like you said, it's a spectrum. They seem to be managing fine without those supports. But my sons and other people like my sons, this is a lifeline for them. Without them, they can't get an education. They can't, get the supports they need to be independent. So I will not allow that to happen. And it is happening in Ireland, and it's happening in England, as you know, as well. And it's just really just autistic people doing this are just thinking of their own lived experience and not anyone else's on the spectrum. How does that make you feel, like as somebody with similar age, like getting older? I mean, does that concern you? And what do you think we should do? Do you think we need some kind of a legislation to protect autistic people from this possibly happening?
Oh, definitely, Fiona, I do. Well, first of all, I'll begin on a couple of points just before I talk about the legislative side and the campaigning in the future for autistic people. Now, how I got involved with these dodgy autistic advocate organisations was a group was set up called Neurodivergent Labour. I won't mention any names or individuals at this point. And John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, was supporting it. Now, I was trying my really hardest to work with them. Then what happened was there was a disagreement over what caused autism, and I explained what had caused mine, lack of oxygen in the brain during birth. It turned viciously nasty, which just, I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was actually breach of the Equality Act in Britain. And if these people were making these statements at work in the public services, they would be sacked for gross misconduct, disability discrimination. However, one of them decided to do a survey on, we want to rustle up sources for or against of people born with lack of oxygen in the brain. This was on a Facebook group called the Autistic Cooperative. And the responses were just sickening and unbelievable. I protested and explained, but what happened was I was actually banned from this organisation, which I have to say, Fiona, is a badge of honour to me personally. I'm hearing all these stories like, I should stay away from you, what absolute rubbish, because the reason I first made contact with you is actually because I think I was introduced to you by members of the autistic advocate organisations themselves, the dodgy people, shall we call them. Now, I was very concerned about Ireland. I was invited to speak on autism back in 2015 at the Jim Connell Festival with the Meath Labour Party. I was absolutely horrified to hear that there was no law on hidden impairments or invisible disabilities apart from Gladstone's Lunacy Act of the 19th century. I was absolutely shocked to hear this. And so I wanted to make contact with autistic campaigners in Ireland. It was difficult to find them. But when I was introduced to you, I thought this was a golden opportunity. And you were doing great work, fighting against bleach cures of autism. But as you and I both agree that the autistic rights in Ireland is appalling. It was a great concern to me because my family are from Ireland. And when I grew up in a prejudiced society in Britain, people used to say, oh, well, we know why you're thick, because you're Irish. That was the attitude. Oh, that shows why you're Irish, because what I had the condition at the time in Britain. So I saw it as a very serious issue that something had to be done in Ireland as well. So hence the reason I thought it was important to engage with you, because nobody else in Ireland was engaging with me at all whatsoever. So I think that's an important step forward and the valuable and the great work that you do, Fiona. As I talk about the legislative side, now there's the Autism Act, which was passed in 2009. And so far, there's only been 2 consultations on autism strategy about supporting autistic people. But I think after what's happened with the new events, I think we need to push for a new consultative strategy on these dodgy, dangerous autistic advocate groups. We need tougher regulation. We need more of a zero tolerance to protect vulnerable autistic children and adults against these groups and organisations. We also need to make it quite clear that autism is a disability, that is not an identity or a way of life. And that is very clear in the legislation. And already, I can't go into the detail at this point, Fiona, But we've now got some people trying to put up motions at trade union conferences to
Really.
say, oh, neurodiversity is not a disability. And believe me, I am making a challenge. I am not going to
But you
sit
see,
and
but you
stand
know,
up and
they have an idea of neurodiversity that isn't true. You know, I mean, I
yeah,
studied autism in UCC in 2012. I did a diploma in autism studies, and neurodiversity was created to include everybody, not just
yeah,
a selected few. And like the disability community in Ireland is suffering enough with, you know, basic things like not having wheelchair access. That would be a huge thing that I would have campaigned for. In 2016, I ran in a general election in Ireland, and I met with a lot of disabled people. And the stories I heard were so sad, really, how they weren't able to access shops or, you know, go to appointments, even medical appointments, because the roads weren't, you know, properly kitted out for wheelchairs, pavements were too narrow, you know, practical things like that. But what really shocked me was the fact that there seemed to be that kind of uncomfortableness around the word disability, that you shouldn't say it. It was like a dirty word. And I see that now with this movement, that they are trying to remove that word as well. But the reality is, you get a diagnosis because you have a disability. You don't get it for any other reason.
yeah,
And a lot of these people are on disability allowance, okay? They're taking that benefit from the government, and then they're going out and saying the opposite, you know, that this is not a disability, which I find absolutely disgusting, because it's not easy to get disability allowance. It isn't easy in Ireland. It's quite a, you know, difficult thing to do.
yeah,
And so if you don't think you are disabled, don't be claiming that you are disabled. Don't be taking benefits away for those that need it. You know, the majority of autistic people are unemployed. You know, that's what stats show, especially in Ireland. When I was in college, less than 1% of autistic people were in full-time employment. And I mean paid employment. A lot of autistic people in Ireland are working in supermarkets where they're not getting paid. I met with them, and I've been told by managers, oh, we're training them. My own son was offered work a few years ago, part-time, in a paint shop, and he was really excited. He went for interviews and training. They told me they'd given the minimum wage, that was fine. To be told then at the end, no, we're not paying him, but at least he was getting out of the house. So I told them what they could do with their job. So there is no protections there. But the reality is, if we take the supports away from people on the spectrum, they won't be independent. They won't learn how to advocate for themselves, to fight that discrimination. So for me as an advocate, the best thing we can do is teach or give autistic people the supports and the skills to become advocates themselves, so that they don't have to depend on other people, so that they know how the law works, they know what they can be entitled to. But they can't achieve that unless they have the supports to make that happen. And the only way they can get the supports is by saying, you know, I have a disability. You don't get supports. Like my sons in school won't get an SNA, special needs assistant, because they're different, because it's a religion. These are the words they're using, or because it's a culture. And also I've seen them say that it's a race, you know, that we are a race. I mean, it's bullshit. And I will say that because I've seen so many crazy things. And the thing is, a lot of these people, like I said, are making huge profit, you know, selling merch, even charging for their videos on Facebook. Can you believe that, Austin? They're charging money for their videos on Facebook, to be telling people that I'm a bad person. I'm not autistic, by the way. They say that I'm faking my autism, that I'm a martyr mum, that, you know, my kids should be with someone else. They don't even have kids, a lot of these people. They're not even bringing up children on the spectrum. They don't know what it's like to be a full-time carer. It's hard, you know, I will say that. You know, autism is great in many ways, but in some ways it's very hard. You know, that's why we go and seek help. That's why I went and sought a diagnosis. It wasn't because I was happy. It was because I was struggling. And I have no shame in saying that, you know. In my teens, my life was hell. You know, it was so hard in school. I had an eating disorder. I had a lot of problems, which were really coping mechanisms, because I didn't understand myself. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know my brain was wired differently. If I'd known that in my teens, I could have saved myself a lot of pain. You know, so I mean, that's the thing. We need to keep that. You know, that we need to be scientific about autism. It's not just about, you know, positive acceptance We need to, autism is not like other conditions. It's very, very different for the individual. That's why this whole element of what they see as the one size fits all rhetoric is really dangerous. It's not. No two autistic people are the same. I mean, I can bring this, information to the table because I'm autistic myself. I'm a mother of autistic children. My eldest son is 28, and I have, gone through his life with him. He was diagnosed in 94, and it's been hard. But you know what's the most important thing is, Dylan did get supports when he was young, and they were safe, proven interventions. They weren't these bleach cures or anything dangerous. They were tools that helped Dylan to be independent. He is so confident now. He can go into shops. He can order things himself. He can talk for Ireland. Literally, saying in Ireland, if you met him, he's so sociable, much better than me. I look to Dylan for help with those things because he helps me. So Dylan had those supports when he was younger, and now he's really independent, and he can advocate for himself. With his cancer diagnosis, he sat with his oncologist and he did it all himself. I mean, myself and my husband Tim are so proud of him, but I don't think Dylan could have done that unless he'd had those supports in an early life. He had the best start in life. He had the best people helping him. And I want to say that here in West Cork, there's a great team, Coaction, who do great work for people with disabilities and for autistic people. And even when Dylan was sick, they were Zooming him, they were calling him, they were helping him in that regard, and they do great work. And these autistic union people are so disrespectful to groups like that. I've seen them attack organizations on Twitter, saying that they're doing this, that, and the other. No, they're not. They're actually helping autistic people. They're giving them the tools to give them freedom to be independent and not dependent on other people as much as we can. Like Dylan does need a lot of care. He always will, but there's things he can do. Like he can walk on the road now. When he was smaller, he was like a flight risk. He would run onto the road. He had classic autism. Dylan would have been, if you wanted to go down the kind of medical model of autism, he would have ticked those boxes, all of them. And I was 21 when I had Dylan. I was practically, I was very immature, and I was thrown into this. It was hard. But you know what? I knew that Dylan was autistic when he was a very young baby, maybe 3 or 4 months, because my sister had a baby at the same time. And I could see the differences between Dylan and his cousin. And I pushed for a diagnosis because then, like you said, to get a diagnosis is hard anyway. And I suppose Dylan was very young. He was 2, which was very young to be diagnosed back in that time. And but the whole assessment back then was much more professional, with a lot more time taken. That's the other thing I worry about, is a lot of these people are not getting proper diagnosis. They say they're autistic, they go online, they might do an online quiz, and they diagnose themselves. That's something I have an issue with. How do you feel about that then? I mean, do you think that's something we should be concerned about as well, that maybe a lot of these people are not really autistic and they are out there influencing people through their own opinion of themselves?
Well, extremely concerned on that one, Fiona, first of all. It's not acceptable in British employment law for self-diagnosis of any disability or autism. So if one wants to take an employer to the employment tribunal for disability discrimination on the grounds that one was self-diagnosed with autism, that case wouldn't stand. And there's been a terrible case once of a cleaner who was raped at university. She claimed she had mental depression and had a disability, but she wasn't diagnosed. And what happened was, when she went to the employment tribunal, she quoted from World Health Organizations, but the employment judge said, unless you've got a diagnosis from a top medical specialist, a psychiatrist, that you have depression, I can't accept your case for disability discrimination. So that's how tough the law is in Britain. Now, interesting about self-diagnosis, because I've represented members, what's happened was there was a case of one who was stalking women after work. There was another case of a person with indecent exposure in the toilets as well. And when they were being disciplined or about to be dismissed, well, the first one who was stalking claimed he was autistic. but we saw no evidence of a diagnosis. And the other one was claiming obsessive compulsive disorder. So there is a danger of that being open to abuse, but I think it's important that people do have a proper diagnosis. I think also, as I'm learning now, because the reason why this self-diagnosis movement started, there is no free medical health care in other countries.
Yes, correct.
They're far too expensive. We have what's called the National Health Service. Now, I was diagnosed straight away at the age of 4, and there was no waiting for this for me at the time. But because of the cuts in the National Health Service, the waiting lists are much longer. But I think that's what we need to campaign for, free medical health care.
That's really
as
important.
A human right.
Yeah, and that's really important because, like, even in Ireland, like even with my own sons being diagnosed, it's taken a long time. It's like there is a waiting list. So a lot of people are doing that. They're going down that alternative route. And, you know, that is something I feel, you know, if you self-diagnose yourself because you can't get a diagnosis, that's one thing. But I'm talking about people that choose not to get the professional diagnosis that can possibly get a diagnosis. So there's two groups, one that are in that remit where they can't get a diagnosis due to cost or the health system being, you know, a mess or whatever. But then there are people that just want to do it themselves, and they go out and they say, I'm autistic, and there's no evidence of that. And then they're making TikTok videos and they're reaching maybe 500,000 people. And there's vulnerable people looking at that thinking, oh, that's what autism is, but it might not be that. Do you understand? It might not be autism. And that endangers people, in my opinion. And what really shocks me is these campaigners are apparently against pseudoscience and they're anti-quackery. But in one regard, they're acting very much like quacks by behaving in this way, by saying this. Because, you know, autism, if you go through a proper assessment, which you probably did like myself, it's not easy, you know, it's several interviews, and if you have a child, it's really complex. They have to meet your child at home, they have to meet them in school several times, so it's like several interviews. Took my son roughly 6 months to get a diagnosis, my last son. Really? I'm glad it happened that way because I know that it was done properly. And then in Ireland, just to touch on that as well, we've no regulation in psychology. So any Tom, Dick and Harry can set up a website and pose as a psychologist. This has happened to me, though I was a victim. I've been diagnosed twice. One by an unqualified person posing as a psychologist, a proper psychologist. Then I went through the HC and I had a proper assessment done. So in Ireland, it's the Wild West for quackery. You've no regulation in psychology. Dietitians are regulated. So a dietitian is more regulated. Actually, sandwich making has more regulation than psychology. So we have fake psychologists diagnosing children and adults in Ireland as we speak. And then we have no legislation. Now, the autism bill that you're talking of in Ireland, I campaigned a lot for that. I met with I met with politicians that were responsible for that bill. And it's just continuously gone on the wayside. So it's there, but it hasn't been brought into law, okay? So we have nothing in Ireland to protect autistic people. And it's shocking. But what is more shocking is the fact I tried to add a clause to that bill to accommodate these awful quack treatments like the bleach cures that you talked of. And I was turned down, you know, by the people responsible for that bill. They didn't want to add that into the bill. I mean, that to me is a priority, protecting autistic people's lives, protecting children from being poisoned with bleach should be a priority, but it wasn't. So there's a problem with the people that are handling that bill as well. They want to keep some kind of, I don't know, they want to shut out that element of it. Now, that concerns me, is that it's not in the right hands. So, I mean, at the moment in Ireland with our government, it's a bit of a mess and COVID and everything, but like that is something that I would like to work with you in the future, is getting that bill active, getting it active and put into law, and adding these other things that we're talking about, regulation around advocacy work. I think that's very important, and regulation against these quack treatments. That should be number one on the list. And, you know, putting something in law that gives supports for autistic people and their families indefinitely, not just in a short-term thing, because we have no Disability Act that works in Ireland. It's not, again, you know, when I studied autism, I studied law policy, and it was so depressing. There's nothing, basically. So the government can do what they want to us. And the sad part is for autistic people is that it's very hard to get out there and campaign for your rights because of your condition, because of the social communication condition. So we're easy pickings for quacks. We're easy pickings for the government to roll us over, and they do again and again and again. And what we have now is a movement of autistic people, whether they are or not, that's the question to be answered, who have sabotaged, and I'm using that word, or hijacked advocacy work, and they're basically creating their own model. And I've seen this in Ireland where they're actually creating a model. They're using scientific terms when they're not. These are not experts in autism. They're not qualified in that regard. They're acting like academics. They're using wording that looks like academic wording when it's not, and people are being duped because we've no supports for autistic people in Ireland. We've no legislation. We've no rights. They're making great headway in countries like Ireland because families need help and they think these people are experts and they think they're legitimate. So there's a lot of things that are happening very quickly with this movement. Now, I've tried to talk to the Autistic Union, the people that head it, and they've just threatened me, abused me. They don't want to talk. They don't want to. There's like Northern Ireland, you know, in Ireland, the peace process. The only way we move forward as a country was to sit around the table together, but they're so uncivilized that they won't even do that. They won't talk. Instead, they want to basically silence people like myself, like you, and other people with concerns, threaten us, attack us, defame us. I mean, you've seen some of the stuff that's happened to me. Sexist comments. I've been called a famine victim. I've had my parents attacked, my children attacked. It's been awful, and it's not getting better. And like, I've ignored a lot of this because if you kept looking at this stuff, you'd drive yourself crazy. I have bigger fish to fry. I write. So I'm working on a very important article at the moment, and it's a miracle I was able to do this today with the help of Timmy. But like, I do work very hard, not just in relation to autistic rights, but protecting cancer patients as well from quackery. And these people are jeopardizing my work. So basically what they're doing effectively is fighting against the community that they want to protect, because if they stop me helping people, they're not helping autistic people. And I'm not going to allow it, Austin. I mean, I am engaging with other parents, not just in Ireland, but beyond. We see a pattern, and we need to have regulation. And I think Facebook is the biggest problem for this happening. The fake accounts they use. So even if you block these people, the advocates, the head ones have mentioned, they have so many fake accounts, you can't escape them. But like going forward, what would you suggest as like a regulation into advocacy work? What do you think would be effective?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Fiona. Well, first of all, social media is just a new rising force we've never had to deal with before, because I need to make you aware, there was a group called the English Defence League, which was hardly anything, with, had started up a network with football hooligans and all the rest, and just apparently mushroomed in about 6 months as a very powerful organisation. That was down to social media. Now the same thing is happening in the United States over Trump supporters. They have grown over social media and are very dangerous. Now this is obviously, we assume this is happening to autistic advocates. They are checking the followers. I don't think they're as big as the far right, if that's any consolation. But on the other hand, I think people like you and myself, we need to form alliances, and we need to counter these people all the way, and we need to tackle and fight them every which way we can. If I was just to talk about Britain, I know you said it was 1% autistic people in Ireland are employed. Now, we had a statistic, it was 15% in full-time work, only went up by 1% in 10 years to 16%, a further 9% in part-time employment. But apparently I've just heard this year that the figure is now declined for autistic people. It's at 20% in total, which is not good news, or 25%.
That's awful.
So yeah, that needs to be looked at. And when you compare that with the figure of disabled people, you're talking over 53% in England. Compare that for disabled people. It's over 46% in Scotland, and Wales is higher than Scotland, by the way, a smaller country, 48%. But the country with the lowest employment rate of disabled people is Northern Ireland, 37.8%. So there isn't just problems like sectarianism, there is a lot of ableism. It's been reported to me in Northern Ireland as well. And the Good Friday Agreement, I think which you've just mentioned, and people spoke around the table. Now there's a North-South Council, Ministerial Council, 12 different bodies, but they haven't got one body on equalities, not one on disabilities whatsoever, at a time when the far right is growing both sides of the Irish border and the discrimination against disabled people. There's also the British Irish Council, but that seems to be MPs and TDs meeting now and again. You know, talking shop is probably what it's been referred to. So what I've done from the TUC Disabled Workers Committee, I've pushed for the first historic meeting ever with the disabled workers of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, both sides of the Irish border. We had our first introductory meeting just in May, not long ago, a few weeks ago. So, and I did mention autism, and they took an interest in that, and they said they've got a long way to go on this one. But they did welcome the talks as very constructive and positive. So we were talking to representatives of disabled workers, both sides of the Irish border, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic.
That's brilliant, Austin. Yeah, that's really important. Yes, thank you. I mean, that's great, because you're so great. You're doing work for Ireland while you're in England as well, and it's great that you have that reach. Do you miss Ireland? Like, would you like to come back, or how do you feel about Ireland?
I would. I love visiting Ireland. I would make sure, since my father died, I was going there every year. I wasn't just visiting relations. I was visiting friends, and sometimes I couldn't do Ireland all in one go. So it's very interesting. But must find an opportunity to come and visit Cork more often.
Oh yeah,
I've got some relations outside Cork City. So.
We have an Irish coffee appointment, haven't we, Austin? When you come over, yeah. So I mean, I'm getting my second vaccine on Wednesday, and Tim and I will be fully vaccinated, and Dylan is vaccinated now as well, our son. So it's kind of like a little bit of freedom coming our way.
Yeah.
But I mean, just to close, because I've taken a lot of your time.
That's all right.
What would you say to people watching? What would be your main concerns about autism issues at the moment, and what would you prioritize in relation to that?
I think we've got a new strategy in going forward. Like, autism is definitely a disability. Autistic children need more support. We need to put more investment into that, and education as well, because our special education needs are being cut to the bone. We need to support autistic teenagers, those who are adolescent, because there are stories of many of them committing suicide, which is terrible. How we go forward, what support mechanisms we need to get in place, how we can make them part of mainstream society. And I certainly believe that there is only one community. I don't believe in any other community, the human race. So whether you're LGBTQ+, whether you're a different ethnicity, whether you're disabled, even if you're autistic, we're all fighting to be part of that human race. So I think that's important. As for the autistic advocate organisations who attack us, this is a catastrophe. My message to these people is, we want solidarity, we want unity, we want to respect that autistic people are disabled and give them as much help and support as possible. Because if you continue to attack us, you're handing a victory to the most prejudiced people in society, including the far right. They're the people who are winning with these divisions. So it's important that we stand united, we stand in solidarity. I find it an honour and privilege to talk to you on this video today, Fiona. I'm more than happy to give support to Ireland as well. My own great uncle fought in the War of Irish Independence for United Ireland as well. And what I see in Ireland today is appalling. Some of the laws that are so behind the times. I think, the Irish diaspora need to give people like yourself as much support into finding a better way of life in Ireland. But also, I'm more than happy to do it as an autistic person for yourself in Ireland as well. So I welcome that with open arms.
I think you're an amazing man, Austin, and I think that you have the ability to be a great politician. I don't know if that's something you want to do, but I suppose that's what I think we need really in government are autistic people, at the table, politicians, autistic politicians that can make those changes.
Very much
reality. So. It's like enough of the token gestures and enough of the feeding us scraps, give us the rights that we deserve. Yeah. And I think segregation is wrong. I agree with you. I think all of the groups that are being affected by discrimination need to come together, work together, support each other. And even for the haters out there watching, we will talk to you if you want to sit at the table. We are open for discussion. We want the fighting to stop. We want to protect autistic people, especially the ones that need support the most. And that's who we're really advocating for, Austin. I think people like Dan, my son, people
Absolutely.
like, you know, children that need to learn the tools to be independent as much as they can. And we're not going to stop fighting, are we, Austin?
Yeah. No,
This
we're
is,
going to keep the campaigning.
this is
Yeah.
the first of many interviews. It's the first time I've done this. And just for people watching, thanks for listening. It's Austin Harney from England and Fiona O'Leary. We're both autistic. We're campaigners for a better world for autistic people. And we want to be honest about autism. We support
Absolutely.
acceptance. We want to end division. And we want people to come together, like Austin said, unity, and work together for a better future for all people, autistic, like anyone in the community. We need to come together. I will probably be doing more interviews, hopefully, once I get the hang of this. And I'm sure Austin is going to be back on here many times with updates on his campaign work. I hope you will, Austin, come back and talk to me.
Oh, I will.
Yeah, and because Austin does a lot of, you know, there's people here online that are working and claiming advocacy. Austin's a real life advocate. He does so much good work offline in the real world. And that's why I have such respect for you. And I see how hard you work. And I think you're an incredible advocate and a great speaker. And I'm lucky to be your friend. So that's it from Fiona O'Leary in West Cork and Austin in the UK. Thanks for watching. Autistic Rights and Wear a Mask. Goodbye.